All right, so we've been waiting a long time to see what Sue Robinson's ruling is going to be on this Deshaun Watson situation. If you have not heard yet, it came down at like 9 in the morning, almost exactly. That Sue Robinson's suspension recommendation for Deshaun Watson is going to be 6 games based off of the hearing that they had. Now, there's some important things to remember about that hearing and what was brought in and what was not brought in that case, because remember, they only tried 4 cases out of the 24 or whatever it was with Deshaun. So that is also factoring in here. But the recommendation for suspension is going to be 6 games. Now, as much as I would like the story to end there, right? Right, where it's just 6 games. All right, let's wait it out. Story doesn't end there necessarily, just because there are some other things that can happen that can affect the length of this suspension. I'm going to go through some tweets, play a video, so we can all know and have the understanding of what this situation is. I feel like these tweets kind of explain a lot of what the situation is. So more from Josina, who says, now we wait to see if the NFL will appeal Sue Robinson's decision that Deshaun Watson should be suspended for 6 games per the CBA. They have 3 days and get a response in 2. Okay, so 3 days for the appeal and get a response in 2. So I'm thinking we're going to hear they're going to appeal in 3 to 2 days, 3 to 2 business days, just like prime shipping. All right, cool. Separately, sources close to the situation are waiting to see and read the logic of her ruling as we speak. All right, so there is some misinformation about what the league's power is here, because yes, can the league say screw Sue Robinson, we're going to suspend Deshaun Watson indefinitely? Still, they could. It's not going to work out for them, right? The reason it would not work out for them is because if you're the NFL and you do that, you have now to explain once, because if you do, let's say the NFL does appeal, take this to federal, to appeal and give Deshaun Watson more games or indefinite suspension, then Deshaun Watson can appeal that ruling from the NFL to a federal court. Here's the problem the NFL runs into if that happens, which it would most certainly happen if the NFL decides to appeal and add games. So if they do that, the NFL is now going to be stuck in a situation where they have to explain why they felt like the evidence warranted a heavier suspension than what a former federal judge determined that the evidence gave them suspension wise to another federal judge. You see where the problem is for the NFL, right? So yeah, the NFL has the advantage when it comes to appealing because they can appeal and amend, but they do have to worry about an appeal. Also, another thing that, I don't know how long this appeal process would take, but also another thing about the appeal would be that there is a possibility that this could go into the season. If Deshaun is federally appealing this to the courts, there is a chance that the courts can, I think they call it an injunction. I'm not a lawyer at all, but they can give you an injunction or whatever to suspend the suspension until the federal court rules on whether the suspension amendment would be legal or not. So again, looking like more than likely it's going to be 6 games. Let's continue to read more takeaways from this situation. Also, some more news here. Mary Kay Cabot reporting updated statement with Tony Busby from the Browns. Deshaun is settling 3 of the remaining 4 civil suits this morning. This came out at like 1 in the morning or something like that. Really odd timing for this to come out. But yeah, so before all this came out, it had been technically reported that Deshaun is going to settle 3 of the 4 remaining, which means he only has 1 case, civil case pending, which means that's probably a domino. It's going to fall sooner than later here. But again, 3 of the 4 civil cases are now being settled. What did Jeremy Fowler have to say here? Okay, so Jeremy Fowler says Sue L. Robinson's comprehensive 15-page conclusion stated that though Deshaun Watson violated personal conduct policy, there was no evidence to justify an indefinite suspension per league. Sources believe what the league wanted. Again, no evidence to justify. So if Sue Robinson, a former federal court judge, is ruling that you have no evidence to justify in your CBA a indefinite suspension based on past precedent, even if the NFL does decide that they're going to make this an indefinite suspension through appeal, the federal courts are likely to overturn that because, again, Sue's a former federal judge. There's just that if that's how a judge is going to look at it, right? Not the NFL, but a judge. The NFL has to know that appealing this, bringing it back to another judge, like they're gambling at that point. But it's not a likely outcome. Albert Breer had some interesting things to say about this whole situation, too. We're going to read what he had to say. By the time you read this Monday, it's possible a decision. So he wrote this before the whole thing came out. Albert Breer at the Monday Morning Quarterback. Shout out to Chops on Twitter. He put this up. But if he hasn't, then it will come soon. My educated guess is that Sue rules, and that'll be that. And her decision will stand. The NFLPA has already put out a statement. By the way, that did come out. The NFLPA put out a statement before the suspension saying they're not going to appeal it. So unless the NFL appeals it, that's the only way this thing goes to a federal court, whatever. So the NFL put out a statement that they're not going to be appealing it. They're going to be standing by Sue Robinson's ruling. Why? Simply put, this will be the third time that Watson's case has been before a judge, counting the 2 grand jury rulings. And at this point, as the union sees it, that's enough. I also don't think the league will fight Robinson's ruling, whatever it is, as the tea leaves have looked this way for quite some time. Now, a fair question asks is, hey, why wouldn't the NFL just appeal this regardless? There are reasons why I don't think the NFL is going to appeal it. One, I already brought up that it's already going to be an uphill battle for the NFL because no matter what they appeal and amend the suspension to, it's going to be challenged in a federal court, where there's already been a precedent of a federal judge ruling that what the NFL had in this case is only worth 6 games of a suspension for Deshaun Watson, and that they did not have enough evidence to go forward with an indefinite suspension. So that is one thing key there. 2, let's not forget that the NFLPA weren't the only people who wanted there to be an independent arbiter in these cases. This is something that NFL owners wanted. And yes, Roger Goodell is the commissioner of the NFL. He is not in charge of the NFL. The 32 owners are really in charge of Roger Goodell. So the owners wanted an independent arbiter because they felt like the league was taking on too much moral responsibility by handling every disciplinary case or any off the field situation in their own kind of court thing. What some of the owners, I can say, want is some level of distance from that whole process and let people who are qualified in that field to make the decisions in that disciplinary section of the league, right? The league's going to always have set-in suspensions for drug policy violations, gambling, anything that can affect what they call the integrity of the game. And when I say integrity, I mean the ability for the fan to know that you're getting wins and losses based off of the player's performance on the field, not based off of a player cheating by taking a performance-enhancing drug or a player tanking gains because of gambling. Those suspensions are already going to have guidelines because those are the things that affect the bottom line. When it came to this kind of stuff, the Zeke Elliott thing, you can remember Jerry Jones put out a statement pretty much saying, hey, the league's doing too much here, right? Why are we trying to be judge, jury, executioner when we're not qualified to do that? That's why Sue Robinson is here. So again, this is not just something that that the players wanted. This is something that owners wanted. And again, Albert Breer continued in a Twitter thread that says, if you want precedent here, Browns QB 6-game suspension mirrors the penalties for Zeke Elliott and ex-Steelers quarterback Ben Roethlisberger. Watson's cases, like Elliott's and Roethlisberger, lacked criminal charges. He goes on to continue. Sue Robinson's decision wasn't based on the 24 lawsuits. It was based on 5 cases brought by the NFL. 4 of the 5 were plaintiffs. So yes, there's a lot more accusations against Watson, but Robinson's decision is based on those 5 cases that were presented with her. Again, another thing to note in that whole situation. He also says here, the NFL and NFLPA negotiated this process in 2020, and the league agreed to it in part because some owners, after so many missteps in discipline over the last decade, wanted the NFL to take a step back in that arena. And in essence, this outcome is some of it. So again, further evidence to point that it's not just the players that wanted an independent arbiter. It's the owners who wanted this because, again, they want some distance from this. If they feel like a player should get a year, they don't feel like they want to take the PR hit if that player does not get a year for that suspension. Because, again, the NFL is a business at the end of the day. Albert Bear continues, says, so Goodell and the NFL's decision here is complicated. Do they want to undermine the process they just established? Do they want to go back to federal court with the player? Again, this has not ended well the last couple of times they have done it. If the NFL appeals and Goodell overturns it, it could actually lead to Watson playing in the opener. If Watson were to file a lawsuit, the union / his camp would likely seek a TRO to put a stay on the suspension if they got one, and he'd play while the case was in court. So now the NFL has 3 days to appeal. I imagine they'll be paying closer attention to public reaction over that time. And if they do appeal, it has to be based off of Robinson's process. Facts of the case, remember, it's 5 cases presented. So the NFL, if they appeal this, cannot add other cases, cannot add other evidence outside of what they have already argued. They are stuck with the 4 cases that they argued that Sue Robinson, a former federal judge, has already determined that there was not enough evidence to go with an indefinite suspension on, and she recommended 6 games on. Again, I find it highly unlikely that the NFL changes this, it goes to federal court, and then the federal courts throw out what Sue said and uphold what Roger does. I think it's a lot more likely that this thing does not get appealed, period, by the NFL. I think that's probably the most likely situation. But I also think there's a chance here that the NFL does try to add some games on here, make it to 12, and then that gets put up in court. And then Deshaun gets suspended 6 games ultimately, because I think this is going to stick what Sue said. Having a former federal court judge in there makes this process a lot more valid in the court of law than I think what a lot of people assumed. I think people thought this was just play court and then like Roger's going to do what he wants to do. This can get appealed to federal court. It's not going to go well for the NFL if this is how Sue saw it. And again, they can't add stuff. They can't change their argument. They have to stick with what they've already said. This is not they're not retrying the case. This is an appeal off the current case. So you can't really change anything. There is a video out here. I'm going to let that video play right here.
The Browns personnel, as this day goes on, there were regularly scheduled press conferences and practice. I would certainly imagine that the news of the day with Deshaun Watson suspended 6 games is going to alter that process, at least to a certain degree. Now, in terms of the terms of this suspension for Deshaun Watson, it was handed down by Sue L. Robinson. It is a 6-game suspension. There is no additional fine. Deshaun Watson also must only get massages from club-directed personnel, must also avoid any adverse involvement with law enforcement going forward here. In terms of the potential appeal that Judy was just laying out here, let's talk about how this 2020 CBA process on discipline came to be. The reason it's set up this way, with the appeals officer, the disciplinary officer, making the initial decision, and then Roger Goodell or his designee handling any appeal, is because the NFL Players Association wanted to avoid situations where the NFL suspended players based on a lack of evidence. In this case, had Sue L. Robinson ruled that the NFL did not prove any violation, then the NFL could not have appealed that. There would be no suspension. The process would be over. In this case, she did find that there was sufficient evidence to justify a 6-game suspension. Robinson wrote in part that his pattern of behavior was egregious, but she pointed out that in her opinion, and based upon the evidence, it was nonviolent sexual conduct. That is how she arrived at a 6-game suspension. The NFL had asked for an indefinite suspension of at least 1 year. In settlement talks, they refused to go below a 12-game suspension for Deshaun Watson. For now, it is a 6-game suspension. The NFL does have the option to appeal. They would have to file that within 3 days. The NFLPA would then have 2 days to respond, which means if there is an appeal, that entire process doesn't even get to go.
And that kind of explains the whole situation. So a lot of info, I feel like I know. By the way, also another piece of news here. I know this is random. Jack Conklin off PUP. Hey, that's good. It's good. All right. So again, I know I threw a lot of information at you guys. There's just a lot of information out there. Just want to make sure you guys have pretty good information when it comes to this situation as it pertains to how it's going to affect the Cleveland Browns in the upcoming season. My ending thoughts on it is I think it's going to stay at 6 games. People are going to like that, not like that. People are going to compare it to Calvin Ridley. Ultimately, Calvin Ridley got his suspension based off of a different part of the CBA than what Deshaun is going to be tried under, right? Like that, they were just under different rules, under different sections. There are different suspensions for different things. If people don't think that's fair, if the players don't think that's fair, they have the right to try to change those things in collective bargaining agreements. But that is what is that's what the CBA is. So I think he's going to get 6. I think since this has been arbitrated by a federal judge, it's going to stay at 6, one way or the other, right? This can go the long way to stay at 6, or it's going to go the hard way or the easy way. I think it's ultimately still going to stay at 6 games. That means he will be back for the first Ravens game. And I mentioned this in the Q&A before. The difference between 6 and 8 games is big because you add 2 division games in that, right? A game against the Ravens on the road and then a home game on Monday night versus the Cincinnati Bengals. We'll see. But having Watson potentially back for those 2 games going to be great for the team on the football field, at least. So that is the situation. Deshaun Watson suspended 6 games. We've been through the roller coaster with this. It's gone from indefinite, a year, 12. Now we are here with something official at 6. The NFL does have 3 days to officially appeal this decision. Once it is appealed, based off of what the NFL does, Deshaun Watson and the NFLPA might appeal Roger Goodell's appeal to the federal court. And then that's when we'll get a final say on that. So it's probably going to be 6. I think it's going to stay at 6. I know there's a lot of people who are kind of hoping that Roger Goodell uses veto power and kind of writes over that. But even if he does do that, I don't think he has a great chance of that holding up in court. But that's just my thoughts about that. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. You guys have a great day. Have a good night.